Hello and welcome to the Best in Performance. This is an interview series where we sit down with the veteran and thought leaders in the web performance space, learn about the experiences that they've had, the lessons that they've learned, the things they know now that they wish they had known then, and get their thoughts on where things are going. This series is brought to you by Rigor. Rigor offers cloud-based web performance solutions designed to help teams find, fix, and prevent speed and user experience issues impacting their sites and applications. You can monitor real browser user experiences, multi-step API flows, and even benchmark competitors from a simple, easy-to-use interface and easily integrate your performance optimizations directly into your CI/CD workflows to help your teams get fast and stay fast. I'm Billy Hoffman, the CTO of Rigor. With me today is Rich Howard. Rich has had a very interesting career in web performance. He's worked for Vodafone, Williams-Sonoma, Sephora, and Optimal. Rich is currently the founder and CEO of Optimal. Rich, thank you so much for joining us today.
Cool, thank you for having me, Billy. It's a pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Well, we always like to start with you telling the audience a little bit about yourself, Rich, and how you found your way into this ever-evolving world of web performance.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think we all have a different story to tell and we all approach it from a different angle. For me personally, I have a classical computer science background. I was the kid that was, programming from a very young age. I started around 11 or 12 years old. As I studied very early on, I took an interest in interface design and usability and optimization, especially for the web, which back at the time in around 2002 was rapidly evolving. So after I graduated, I started work as a web developer at a company called LexisNexis. I was building interface prototypes for large-scale usability workshops. It was really there that I got to witness firsthand how crucial interface design was, and also the importance of usability. I was also exposed to the work of Jakob Nielsen, who wrote, really as early as '93, the articles on performance in relation to the usability of systems. He discussed the Power of 10 series, and it kind of goes something a little bit like this. So 0.1 seconds is about the limit for having a user feel that the system is reacting instantaneously. 1 second is about the limit for a user's flow of thought to stay uninterrupted, even though the user may begin to notice a delay in the system. And then 10 seconds is about the limit for keeping users' attention focused on the dialogue. For longer delays, users want to perform other tasks, so they sort of shift mental mode at that point. And so you need to begin to give the user some sort of feedback around when the user expects something to be done. So it was really my work at LexisNexis. It laid a strong foundation for usability right from the beginning of my career. I then went on to work as a web developer for many years, and sort of come to about 2007, I was working on a project for the Man Booker Prize for fiction, which is a literary prize that's awarded each year for an original novel written in English and published in the United Kingdom. It was really the first time that I started to build something that would actually work for a large load and a big scale. Because what they effectively had was a series of 3 very key dates in their yearly calendar. It was really the announcement of the long list, the short list, and the winner prize. And so after rebuilding the site, we found that during the long list, we were barely able to cope with the amount of traffic that was expected. And so the site ground to a halt. It was very slow. A lot of users were complaining that they weren't able to figure out any of the results. The challenge for us is that, at the time, we really had no previous traffic data. We really didn't know what to expect when we were facing this load. There just wasn't any analytics data. There wasn't a lot of tooling back then. So performance was really something there that wasn't baked into the original design of the website. And the custom CMS that had been built had been designed to build the pages dynamically for each request. Obviously, when you're trying to serve at scale, that's just not going to work very well.
Yeah.
So we soon realized that we needed to change something in order to be able to handle the load for the shortlist and the winner announcement, and that these spikes would actually be even larger than the long list announcement that was made. So the other developers and I actually determined that we needed to implement a caching layer and to cache the page requests so they weren't being built on the fly for each user. We also worked out that we needed to have more powerful server hardware, dedicated server hardware, now that we had a better estimation of the traffic volumes. So yeah, I mean, this was really back in 2005, 2006. Websites were still going down pretty regularly at that point. You know, the field of performance and performance optimization wasn't very mature back then. All we had really was an edict from the client which said the pages need to be responsive during the announcements. So we were able to make the necessary changes to the CMS, introduce a caching layer, so we weren't building the pages dynamically, and also disabled certain key parts of the website during the announcements so that we weren't having to process those as well. We introduced a primitive testing cycle with Apache Bench to try and work out whether we could sustain the set of traffic, and all of this combined really saved the day. Fast forward to 2012, I was then recruited to Vodafone Group. It's a large multinational telecoms company, to work as their lead architect in their global optimization team. So I really, at that point, went from being a full-time developer to being a full-time technical consultant. And it was at that point that I was able to concentrate on performance full-time. So Vodafone had 21 international consumer-facing websites spread around the world, quite a handful. Each one was built using different technical stacks and managed by their local markets as well. So it wasn't sort of 21 cookie cutter websites. It really was literally 21 separate and distinct websites, each with their own kind of set of performance issues. So we were tasked with creating a centralized program to measure and optimize the performance of the sites, and began a program using mainly synthetic monitoring, and subsequently introduced some real user monitoring into the mix as well. The optimization was actually driven in the markets by a series of guidelines and best practice that we wrote specifically for Vodafone. And we really kind of started at that point fixing a lot of the basic issues. So this was server configuration like gzip and HTTP live, and starting on front-end caching and also overall page construction as well. In addition, we also ran a program of yearly deep dives where we would dissect the pages in a lot of detail and come up with a series of optimization recommendations that each of the markets could begin to look at. At the same time, tags, third-party tags were becoming more of an issue for some markets, and so we started to introduce a tag management system to help solve some of those issues, and also come up with guidelines and best practice as well in terms of how the markets could address their third-party issues. So part of the reporting, we actually created a league table where we benchmarked and ranked all of the 21 international websites with each other. Once we convinced the websites to actually follow on with our performance methodology, it actually created some really healthy competition. So the UK didn't want to be slower than Germany. Australia didn't want to be slower than New Zealand and South Africa.
I love that, because how else do you get 21 different teams, or like like we can't consolidate on a common platform. Our platform is the best one for us, and it's the best. It's like, okay, fine, we're going to benchmark all of you and make it really public internally how good you actually are.
Yeah, and we had some really interesting scenarios come up. So at the time, we were having a lot of calls with the German team. Sorry, excuse me. We were having a lot of calls with the German team, and they didn't quite buy into their methodology. At least that's what they said. At the time, they had this lowest ranking website out of the 21, and of course, you know, the Germans are quite competitive. So what effectively happened was that they said to us, oh yeah, we don't agree with your methodology for XYZ reason. But in the background, they were busy optimizing their site, and about 2 months later, they were actually right at the top of the benchmark list. So yeah.
That's awesome. I love both of those stories. Well, first of all, I really love the story about the publishing, because it goes to show what I think is really common with a lot of organizations where they start with, and just make it fast, make it good. Okay, could you quantify that? No, not really. Just a requirement is to make it good. And also, I think that's a very interesting use case, and it's going to get into our topic of today of you had very specific 3 key events, right? The long list of authors, the short list of potential winners, and then the winner where you're going to get big spikes of traffic. You can't go down. You're preparing, really, that's the purpose of this entire website and the contest. And so like it's very key, and there's a logical process to get ready. And even at Vodafone, where you have those 21 different markets, each one of them are going to be having a sale, or they're preparing for a holiday shopping season or something. And so they have sort of this need to systematize an approach to, preparing for an event to make sure that you survive the event.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's an e-commerce website or, a site within a different realm. Chances are, the marketing team is going to be doing a heavy campaign where they might send an email out to, say 50% of the user base. And, those times you end up getting a lot more traffic to your site than you might expect. And so very often the conversations actually need to happen between the business and then also between technology as well, to sort of say, well, how many people are we sending out to? How many people do we expect are going to be engaging in this campaign? What do the numbers actually look like? What do we estimate those at? And then we have to sort of use that data to sort of say, well, hey, can we actually handle that volume of traffic?
Awesome. Yeah, and I feel like let's just formally introduce what we want to talk about here today, which is holiday readiness. So what we mean by holiday readiness is preparing the site for the crush of visitors or customers that are going to be coming. This is a really hot topic right now for e-commerce because the summer is when they sort of start preparing for their big holiday season. But I want to stress, just because this is commonly associated with retailers, it's really this systematic approach to preparing for an event applies to anyone. Rich, you just gave an amazing example of something I think many of our audience would even think about, which is sort of a literary prize. They have very specific dates that they're trying to prepare, and it's just a big of an event. Ticketmaster, oh my God, I can only imagine. They must have a whole checklist for Adele's about to tour. Oh my gosh, we have to get ready. It's the Adele checklist, the Adele readiness checklist.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and these things often happen outside of a typical Black Friday, Cyber Monday season. It could be that an e-commerce site is doing a new product launch, or it could be that a new app has been built for an online bank, and therefore it's calling a completely different set of APIs. There's a lot of different scenarios where you're going to be expecting a whole set of traffic that that you wouldn't normally have.
Yeah, it's a critical event with a project that launches at a specific time. You're building up to it, and you want to make sure that your site stays up and is responsive, and you're getting the maximum return on all your work. We'll probably use the phrase holiday readiness, but throughout this talk, but really it's just shorthand for this sort of specific event. Rich, you've done this a couple times in your career, at Vodafone, at Sephora, at working with this literary prize. Kind of at a high level, talk me through what planning for holiday readiness means for you, and maybe what are some of the different stages that you go through with a holiday readiness plan?
Yeah, so at a very high level, it really kind of starts with a series of scoping exercises. It's understanding, what flows do we want to optimize? How do you determine those? What new things exist now that are not part of the launch that you're going to be running? What is your expected traffic? How much traffic you're going to expect, and what journeys are they going to be sort of following through?
Okay.
So I normally begin this with a discovery session, really to kind of understand that, and also to review any data that we have from previous events. So it could be that the business had exactly the same event last year, if it's a Black Friday, Cyber Monday type event, and there's a whole wealth of analytics that we can look at to really kind of pick apart what happened during that event, and also what went well, what didn't go well, what things do we really need to sort of keep an eye So we begin with that, and then we subsequently follow on to a series of testing that we want to do, really to kind of establish a baseline and understand where we're at. So the baseline is going to be looking at front-end performance, back-end performance, load and scale as well, and sort of overall, where do we stand right now? From there, I'd then like to go into a series of reviews for optimization candidates, and really to kind of work with the team to plan out what's feasible to do given the time periods. What are some of the low-hanging fruit, and how far away are we from where we actually need to be, given the sort of projected volume that we're looking to certify for.
Got it. So what I'm hearing here is, number one, it's understanding scope. So what you're going to be optimizing, just what are you trying, what goals are you trying to reach? What are the things you should be testing? Then there's sort of a testing component. How are you behaving now? What's the experience? What's the capacity that you can support and still deliver that level of experience? And then there's sort of an optimization step or gate where you're applying different, either front end or back end, maybe some stuff with third parties or infrastructure to try to get the experience that you were just able to measure to bring it more in line with the scope you defined in the first stage. Is that a good summation?
I think that's a very good summation. Yeah, and the thing is that sometimes when you do that level of testing, you may find that actually the systems are perfectly fine with being able to handle the expected load. But if the client wants to go ahead and do so, then they could still do some further optimizations, because the whole world of performance is complicated, and we make a lot of design decisions every day about what we want to do with systems. And so, I've never worked with a client where we haven't found at least a few candidates that could be applied that may sort of just give us that little bit of an extra edge.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let's dive into each of those sort of stages individually to really help our audience understand how they actually can go from sort of an academic understanding to a practical, tactical, how do they do it so they can prepare for an event too. So when we're starting with scoping, one of the things you mentioned, Rich, was sort of understanding what you should be testing. And I think a lot of people struggle with this. So when you're trying to scope out everything you need for a readiness plan, where do you like to start? What's the first thing you do?
Yeah, the first thing that I really like to do is to meet with both business and technology stakeholders, really to kind of understand what it is that they're preparing to face with their particular event, and also, some of the technical limitations that they may be working with, or some of the existing plans that they have in place to upgrade or optimize, or to, sort of make sure that they're ready for what they need to do.
I love that, because that also serves as a really good way from the very beginning to set expectations, right? Like business people might be saying, this thing's going to load in half a second. We're going to have a conversion rate that's amazing. And the tech people are like, oh my God, we're dealing with this ancient, J2EE system. And so that's a good way to sort of like start from a common page.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the business and the technology stakeholders may sometimes be talking different languages, but they're all really trying to achieve the same goal, which is to, have a successful event where performance is maintained and the users have a great experience.
That's awesome, Rich. So once you have sort of everyone on the same page around expectations, the next thing you started talking about was like the scope of your testing and sort of the scope of the project. How do you sort of determine the scope of the actual site or the app that you should be testing and optimizing as part of the readiness plan?
Yeah, so there's a couple of primary things to look at here. The first one really is around understanding, sort of the traffic patterns of the site, and to understand, sort of what the expected load and volume and scale is going to be. So you can look at this from various metrics. Very often I'll deep dive into a customer's analytics system to really kind of figure out sort of what particular funnels or user journey the user may be using. Really to sort of understand, which pages, which type of pages are going to be very heavily trafficked, and to sort of start calculating a load model. I'll also do an audit of people's systems as well, really to understand, what measurement and monitoring systems they have in place already. If there's some gaps that need to be filled there, then I may make some recommendations around that. And then also begin to look at how those tools are configured and deployed in each of the environments, and whether they're giving us the data that we're really looking for.
Got it. So that's really helpful. So sort of that two-pronged approach of look at analytics to understand where the flows are and how the users are actually using the app. And then that will also help inform the test cases you'll be monitoring, but also the flows you should be testing as part of your capacity testing. And then also it sounds like a sanity check against, hey, look, if we're going to want to be measuring these parts of the app, what systems do they have in place to give us that sort of, performance insight or experience insight now?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly it.
What do you view as sort of a good, better, best in terms of what systems to have in place, or how many flows? Because there's here's the most common path, but then you have sort of a long tail of some people visit the sitemap and then they go to a category, and then that is a flow. It is not a common flow. So help me sort of understand what's the good, better, best in terms of understanding those flows, and then also what you would like to see from a, monitoring data collection system being in place.
Okay, so good might be defining customer flows based on business transactions. These would be what the business sort of deems to be the most important user flows.
Okay.
Better might be to look at some previous analytics data from the previous event to really kind of understand what those flows are, and to maybe choose the top 10, top 20 user flows that may be going on. Best would be to effectively extract all of the data from the analytics tools, and then use that to build a more complicated model where you may have 100 or 200 user flows. And I do see some companies are sort of modeling on that level of granularity.
So that brings us to testing, Rich. Now that we've sort of gotten everyone on the same page, we've understood the scope of what we're testing and how we're going to test it. Now we actually have to start doing the testing. Where do you suggest people start?
Yeah, so with testing for performance and for seasonal readiness, there's a few facets that we need to look at here. One is really kind of synthetic in the front end. So there's a lot of testing that we can do in that realm, really to kind of understand how the pages are built, and what we need to do in order to optimize all of that. We also have the back end as well, which we need to deal with. So this is anything from the web servers through to the application servers, and their ability to handle all of those requests. Each of those requires different types of testing tool. And so, really when we think about the back end, we want to be looking at load and scalability testing, and then also combining that with some of the APM or application performance management data to give us an understanding of what exactly is happening within our system. So normally with testing, what I like to do is to sort of create a combined strategy whereby we're looking at data from different tools, and then coming up with candidates for optimization based on the data coming out of those tools.
Got it. So you use a multitude of tools to sort of get either back-end data, front-end data, load and infrastructure data, and then when you get it all in one place, what makes you, out of the sea of data, point to a particular place and say, that is the hot spot, that is the area there we should focus?
Right. Yeah. I mean, the the way in which I really approach this is to sort of go back to what we were doing with the scope and the planning, and sort of say, based on the tests that we just run, do we actually meet the criteria that the business and the technology stakeholders are looking for? Are we overall, sort of maintaining our 3-second time to interactive, for instance, or do we see that it's 6 seconds or 8 seconds or 9 seconds when we increase the load on the web servers? So from there, really what I'm looking at is the pages that are important, and combine that with the traffic and the performance degradation that we begin to see as we go through our different levels of load that we apply. From there, we can sort of triage and say, yeah, based on this data, this is a front-end issue or a back-end issue or a content issue or an infrastructure issue, and then we can begin to generate tasks and requests and kind of work with those individual teams to sort of come up with a plan for optimizing those particular areas.
Now, a question I often have people ask me when it comes to testing is where? Or, because if you're testing, people will say, oh, well, we're testing this in a staging environment. That's where we're doing our capacity testing, but it's really not representative of production. Either the hardware is, it's a much smaller scale, or, oh, well, we're not actually loading our third parties, or for cost reasons, we actually don't have our CDN configured on our staging. So like, what's your advice for how and where people should test? And is there a maturity model sort of associated with where you test given your capabilities?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so really when it comes to testing, the customers that are really mature tend to have a staging or a pre-prod environment or a performance environment that is scaled very similar to what we would see in production. Obviously, that tends to be very costly. So for the majority of customers, they're not able to achieve that. Very often what I'll do then is to create a sort of benchmark comparison to really kind of understand performance in the lower environment versus performance in production. What that does is that it gives us a model to say, well, we believe that performance is the pre-prod environment is scaled to 50% of the load and capacity within production. Therefore, when we run our models, we're going to certify half the load of the pre-prod environment, and that will give us a representative sample of 100% of the traffic in production. So you can create a sort of scalability model whereby you can validate the results from production in a pre-prod environment. Obviously, there's an element of art and science to that, because some components may be scaled at 50%, other components may be scaled at 75 or 80%. So that gets a little tricky, but we try and keep it as scientific as possible with the methodology that we're using. So once we have that ability to understand scaling, what we're effectively doing is we're looking at performance results sort of between releases, so we can begin to understand the specific performance characteristics of that environment, both in pre-prod and then also in production as well. And the other thing that I strongly recommend that clients do, especially as they're preparing for a big event, is that they're also testing their production environment, just to kind of give them that level of confidence that they're going to be able to handle that peak load. Having said that, of course, that often becomes difficult. Those sorts of tests need to be done on the site during a window where you haven't got a lot of user traffic to the site, and especially for global websites, that can be difficult to find an appropriate window in which to do that.
Is there anything that you've learned about testing that now that you're like, oh, early in my career, I didn't do it this way, and that either caused you challenges or it made the results less valuable? Like, what's something you can share with our audience based on your experience about a great way to sort of grow in their approach to testing?
Yeah, I think the big one really was that traditional performance testing really doesn't look at the entire system as a whole. And so, especially with modern day websites, they tend to integrate with a lot of third parties, and being able to sort of performance test with those third parties in the mix is often very difficult and very challenging. The third parties may say, it's against our terms of service that you run load tests, within our tools, or it may be that the test tools themselves are not very good at working with those third parties, or processing the output from those third parties. So there's some definite challenges there, but the big thing from my perspective really is to understand the system as a whole, with all of the integrations possible, and to complete the journeys wherever possible. Case in point, with a lot of e-commerce websites, they use third-party credit card processors, and trying to get all the way up to order completion is really difficult, especially in production-based environments. And so, as the client becomes more mature, I definitely recommend that they try and work with their third-party vendors to figure out a way to be able to load test this appropriately.
So after you've done your testing and you've collected this data, now you're starting sort of that feedback loop of optimizing and trying to make faster the hot spots that testing revealed. Rich, talk to me a little bit about how you suggest people approach starting to optimize their site to improve performance and experience.
Mm-hmm. So the first thing is to really start with the data that you've collected. You've set up all of your systems for measurement and monitoring, and at this point, we begin to pour over that data to work out what optimization candidates there are. So it may be that, for instance, there's some server infrastructure issues. It could be that gzip configuration is not configured properly. It could be that there's a lot of objects that are not cached on the page. And through the data, we can sort of pick into that a little bit and really kind of understand where the primary bottlenecks are. It could be that for a particular page there's a very slow database query, and we need to go in and take a look at that. So then we have to work with the DBAs to sort of say, is there a way in which we can restructure that query, or are there some optimizations that we can apply to that query, or even do we want to solve this through scaling up the hardware for our database system? So there's not necessarily one right or wrong answer to the way in which we apply the optimizations, but the data reveals pretty quickly normally where the specific bottlenecks are. It could be that some of the issues are around third parties, for instance, and those can be a little bit more tricky to solve because very often they're outside of our control. So as part of seasonal readiness, what we may actually do is to say, well, this third party is probably not going to perform very well for our users during our peak event. Is this business critical or not? And if it's not business critical, we may actually consider disabling that third party, or using a scaled back version of that third party. With our some of the optimizations that we could apply, maybe the content delivery network configuration, for instance. So very often we have to go back to the team and sort of see what may be possible given the timescales for that. The other aspect that I very often will look at is how are the sites sort of managing bot traffic, and also what preventions do they have in place to prevent a DDoS attack. Especially during a large scale event, if your website gets DDoS, then it's kind of game over for everybody.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that it kind of like with third parties, it goes to show that there are always going to be external factors. Like you could do everything right. You've optimized your back end. You've gotten rid of those slow database queries. You've optimized your front end. You tweaked your CDN, and then you didn't really do a good inventory of third-party tags, and you realize that you've got a couple of A/B testing frameworks that are running and they're slowing you down. So I love that idea of a two-pronged approach of like, review the third parties that you have and be ruthless of like, is this a thing that we need? And it sounds like you could probably go back to that, the very first thing you mentioned, Rich, which is that getting agreement from the business stakeholders about what the goals are and what sort of the expected outcome is, because it comes back to that risk management, right? Like, if this is the expected result, do you really want to like do we really need to have 5 third parties on here right now? Do we really need to be, continuing to run this, intercom chat widget right now?
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And what I often see with these with my clients is that the third parties are generally managed by the business teams. They're often the people that are creating the relationships with the third party vendors, and also from a product perspective, deciding what components they want to integrate into their website. So very often, those guys are the best stakeholders. To be able to go back to them and say, is this really crucial, or what happens if this component fails? We've done our testing and we've determined that the way that your site integrates with this component means that if it becomes unresponsive, then it's going to impact your user experience.
Yes, those third parties that are not being asynced or deferred.
Exactly. Yeah. I think a lot of this then really comes down to a couple of other important pillars around seasonal readiness. One is alerting and monitoring, and then the other is contingency planning for the particular event. So with alerting and monitoring, what we're really trying to do is to understand from a business and a transactional perspective whether the site or the app is running as appropriate, and if there are any issues, that we're also then informing the right people, and that there's also a plan to fix it if there are particular issues as well.
Got it. So this is sort of akin to testing your smoke alarms, right? To like make sure once you launch this, are you monitoring the system? If something bad happens, do the alerts work? Who will be alerted, and like what are the plans that you're going to execute if hey, the CDN is starting to fail over, or the database is starting to have problems. How do you suggest people go about starting that contingency planning?
Yeah, so really it's there's a kind of a people aspect to this, and then also a process and the technology aspect to this as well. So from a people perspective, it's really kind of working out a map of all of the stakeholders that are going to be involved, and who should be receiving alerts, and sort of what the escalation paths are. From a process perspective, it's really about understanding that if an alert is triggered, how are we going to get together to resolve this particular issue that we may be facing? How do we triage it? How do we assign it to a team? How do we react really quickly to a possible issue? And then from a technology perspective, it's really saying, how do we build systems that are more resilient? If a system fails or a component within the system fails, is there a way in which we can recover from that? And is there a way that we can still maintain a customer experience even though one of the pieces is currently not functioning?
It's interesting. I had heard a story once from a company I won't name, but they do Super Bowl ads pretty regularly. So Super Bowl, obviously a big sporting event in the United States, and people are paying upwards of $1 million or more for a 30-second commercial, and they're driving people towards either a particular website, or even if there isn't, people are going to go visit that company afterwards. And they were talking about actually being able to flip certain parts of their site essentially into read-only mode, so they can sort of selectively degrade, hey, usually you can interact with this, like support, like opening a support ticket, usually that's live, but they could toggle it so that it goes into more of like a queue. Okay, thank you for the note, we'll get back to you, just to sort of manage it. Is this an approach that you've ever tried or you've seen people do?
I certainly have, and it's very often something that I'll recommend that an organization do, particularly if they're nervous about going into their peak event. So some of the things that I have seen are disabling of additional functionality. I've seen websites that have temporarily disabled their on-site search, their search tools within their site. I've also seen them scale back or remove some of the third-party systems that they that may be not sort of crucial to the end user flows. Even so far as taking A/B or multivariate testing frameworks off of the site. Often those can be a bottleneck, and when you're trying to maximize performance, they can be a good candidate for temporary removal. The other thing that I see is that there's some technical changes that a site owner may make to their site during a peak event. So this would be particularly around increasing the length of cache, the length of cache headers within their particular assets, and also changes to DNS systems and things like that.
Got it. You know, what you're describing, it really seems like a great opportunity for organizations to almost do an inventory of functionality and sort of make a critical, must and nice, right? Because really what you're saying is at the core, what is it that we want to make sure we're delivering to the customer, and what things are we okay with as contingencies being able to disable to continue to keep that core functionality still functioning.
That's absolutely right. I mean, modern websites contain a lot of different moving parts. Some of them are critical for the end user, and some of them are nice to have systems. One of the common things that I'll see is that you may have like a third-party chat widget that you load up, or a third-party user commenting system. Some of those systems are not critical for the user flow if you're talking an e-commerce website, which is really about making a purchase. They certainly add value, and they help to impact conversion. But especially when you're under a heavy and sustained load, they're very often superfluous to the core requirements.
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought up comment systems, because I think it's something that if you asked a lot of businesses, they would say, oh, well, no, we have to have our comment system. But if you really dig in and say like, well, look, what's the impact to the business if when, Rich comes and he's looking at a product, the reviews or the comments he's seeing are 30 minutes old.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Is it really that big of a deal? And you kind of find out that actually there can be something that you think is critical and must be real time. Actually, it's okay to the business if it's delayed somewhat, especially if that ensures the overall viability of the site.
That's absolutely right. And during sort of peak holiday load, the load can often be 5, 6, 7 times what your normal traffic load would be. And so you have to as a business, you have to make some of these hard decisions about what's truly important for the end user, and what is not.
Excellent. So, Rich, besides just the scoping, the testing, the optimization, and then of course what we've been talking here, how to monitor for the site post-launch, and then coming up with contingency plans for if and when things go wrong, because there are not many sites that can take 7x their typical traffic patterns and not have a couple of things happen. There's a need for a retrospective, which is sort of the post game. The events happened, and it's what's happened and what have we learned. How have you approached retrospectives in your career?
Yeah. So retrospectives are definitely an important part of this whole process, because chances are you're going to have a similar event happen like this in the future, and there's always things that you can learn from the previous event. I think the first piece of advice that I would offer to everybody is to try and have that retrospective as soon as possible after the event. It can get it's very easy sometimes to lose the flow. Everybody kind of gets back to their normal everyday roles after the big event, and so it's easy to forget what exactly happened. it's also important to look at the data retention policy of any key systems that you're using for measurement and monitoring as well.
Mm-hmm.
If your system is only measuring and monitoring and holding or retaining that data for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, then you've really got to make sure that you grab that data as quickly as you can, so that you can dive into it at a later date should you need to do so. The other thing that's really important is with the retrospective is to make sure that you involve members from each of the teams. Every team will have particular things that went well and particular things that went bad, and it's important that that they each have a voice, so that they can share the things that could be improved upon in the next event. So very often, having those conversations in a cross-disciplinary way, I think is really helpful, especially when we're considering complex systems. The database engineer will often need to have a conversation with the application engineer, and the application engineer will very often need to have a conversation with the front-end engineer. So yeah, we definitely need the right people in the room to have those conversations in the spirit of saying, how can we sort of work together better in the future in order to be able to have even more success with our events.
And of course, the output of this retrospective, it's only going to be valuable if you use it as input into that, initial planning and scoping for the next one. How do you suggest people sort of document and share that the sort of the lessons learned and we definitely need to make sure we do blank the next time around, so that in 9 months time, when you're planning for seasonal readiness again, or holiday readiness, or whether it's the next event, you make sure that you're not doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past?
Right. Yeah. I mean, different systems contain different sets of data, and so what's important is to pull out any anomalies or any issues from those systems, and then sort of combine that with some level of running commentary around sort of what went well, what didn't go well. Very often I like to sort of do this with either a giant document that's shared by multiple people, or even an editable wiki page, whereby we can take all of the learnings and sort of combine that into a more coherent document. Very often that's sectioned out by the different disciplines, but then also we look at sort of general issues that have come up as well. Could be that there was a communication issue between one team and another team, for instance, and we can pinpoint that too.
Rich, thank you so much for joining us today. For all of you out there, this is just one of many exciting episodes we've got queued up for this season. We hope you found this as valuable as we enjoyed producing it. If you'd like to follow along with the next episodes, you can check out rigor.com for more episodes as they're published. We'll see you next time, and until then, get fast and stay fast. Rich, that went really well. Thank you.
Yeah, you did a great job, buddy.
I like the how do you make sure you don't do this again? And
yeah, and I'm loving the texture.